In this video, we'll look at the use of constants in VBA. We've seen how you can use variables to store values which potentially can change several times during the execution of your macro. However, you very often need to keep track of values which will always be the same as your code executes. These are the kinds of values which you store in constants rather than in variables. So once again, we're working in the section 3 module of the Word VBA training template. And we're going to create a macro which illustrates the use of constants. And we're taking the example of a message that's displayed in the error handling sections of our macro, which gives the technical support email address that should be contacted when the user has problems. Since this email address is going to be used several times, it's useful to define it as a constant so that if it needs to be changed, we only have to make the change once, and that will update wherever it's been referred to within our code. So let's create our macro, and let's simply call it using constants. I'll just switch across now to procedure view. To declare a constant, use the keyword const as opposed to dim, and it's also useful to make it easy for constants to be distinguished from variables. One technique is to use uppercase letters for the name of the constant. We can still use a prefix, so str, support email. Because everything is uppercase, we need to have a separator between words, and the permitted separator is the underscore character. We then specify the type, just as we do when we declare a variable. But what's different is that because this is a constant whose value will not change, we now have to say what that value is. So let's say support at somecompany.com. Another example of where you would use a constant might be if you had a rate, such as VAT, value-added tax, that we use in Europe, which occasionally is subject to change. So if you're going to refer to it several times during your code, again, you define it once as a constant rather than hard coding the actual rate in your lines of code. So let's take that as our second example. Const SNG VAT rate as single equals 0.2. And we might also want to store a formatted version of this, which would be a string. str VAT rate as string equals 20%. Then let's say we're in the middle of our error handling section, and we want to use an MSG box that includes a reference to these constants. Let's just split the line. So ampersand str support email, and then we'll put a couple of blank lines in. Split the line once more. Then we might say in parentheses hourly rate of, now we could say hourly rate of £50, but what would be better would be to have another constant. So const SNG hourly rate as single equals 50. We could concatenate our hourly rate. subject to VAT at ampersand, let's split the line again, SNG hourly rate, and end with a full stop. So let's save and test our code. So upcoming messages and the values held in our constants are inserted. Let's just go back to full module view for a moment and refer back to the macro that we did in the last video. This variable DAT target is a prime candidate for definition as a constant because it doesn't actually change, it's not designed to change throughout code execution. So here, rather than having dim, we should really have const. And then let's change the capitalization to match. And then, of course, we have to define it. So we can move equals followed by the date. And then let's just delete this. Another candidate would be here. We've hard-coded that figure of 14. It would be far better to define a constant. Let's say it was called int critical date or int critical days, and set that to 14 and use the constant in our code rather than the literal value. So let's do that as well. So int critical days as integer equals 14, and then we can use that name instead of 14. Let's just make sure that we haven't broken the code by doing this. Everything still seems fine, but we've added a bit of clarity to the code that we had. So let's just save our changes. Constants should be used to store values which are required by your macro, but which will not change during code execution. It is also useful to define literal values as constants, rather than embedding the literals in your code.